afternoon, everybody. Hope you've been enjoying the conference so far. My name is Samira Fazli, and I'm excited to be your moderator for our discussion on clean energy supply chains and trade. We're going to have a conversation for the next, 75 minutes on with two leading analysts on clean energy, on the clean energy sector and the outlook for the next 5 to 10 years here in the U.S. and globally. Let me begin by kind of framing where we are in the moment that we're in. 10 years ago, I think at a lot of clean energy conferences, you weren't really talking about supply chains. Instead, we were talking about things like NDCs or carbon prices, maybe mobilizing capital for clean tech. But the last decade, we've just had this breakthrough in deployment, right? Huge accelerations in deployment. I think all of us have probably been reading all the press this week on COP30 that shows us how much progress we've made on the deployment side. And so the question that's become really central for the clean energy industry and for energy transition advocates is now, where are these physical technologies, the wind turbines, the batteries, the EVs, where are they going to come from? That's come into much sharper focus, just how difficult it is to build, make, and transport this stuff, and to secure the raw materials you need to manufacture at scale and distribute efficiently. I'll also add that until relatively recently, most of us didn't really think about supply chains. They were something that happened in the background. We got our goods and services and didn't know where they magically came from until the pandemic hit. And policymakers and the public and the business community started to realize how brittle global supply chains were in the ways that they were structured. In the public sector, since I used to work in the Biden White House on these issues, the public sector started to say, we need to play a bigger role in addressing the risk that these global value chains have to the U.S. economy and to U.S. national security. And so supply chains, while they're owned and operated by the private sector, even in market-driven economies like the US and the EU and Japan started to say, we as policymakers need to think a little bit more about whether we should start deploying policy tools against these kind of critical supply chains, including energy supply chains. The macroeconomic and national security implications have like two different pieces to it. One, supply chain dominance could be a geopolitical tool, people realized, and your enemies can weaponize it against you to hurt your economy or cut off some essential good, which is what we've, I think, all seen this year as the US and China go back and forth over rare earths and AI computer chips. And there's actually an opportunity for supply chains to be a competitive advantage for a company, a source of GDP growth, a source of good jobs. If a country can expand domestic production or develop the global partnerships, the partnerships with allies and diplomatic partners to secure the inputs that you need, which is how the Biden administration, when I was there, was trying to do with electric vehicles and with batteries. So I offer that introduction about supply chains and policy debates that have now become about industrial competitiveness, industrial strategies, national competitiveness, because we've seen politicians on both sides of the aisle actively debating and testing more intentional interventions in the economy for the first time in decades. And that has had a lot of implications for the energy sector more broadly, and for the clean energy sector. And this panel is going to talk more about the market dynamics, not the political dynamics at play here. So after 2 years, let me just offer where we are on the policy side. You've had a real whipsaw effect on where policy has been. We had 2 years of policy tailwinds from the IRA, and now the industry needs to adjust to a new normal from the OBBA. From 2022 to 2024, we saw a 4x increase in investments in clean energy manufacturing here in the US. That's according to data by Rhodium and MIT. But with policy supports removed, where is the market going to head now? Where are we going to see cancellations, or can projects continue just on a longer timeline now? At the end of the day, it's not just policy that drives these things. It's the business cycle and business demand that's going to drive company strategies here. So on this panel, we're going to talk about where has demand for clean energy shifted here in the US, where is it shifting around the world, and what does the new technology pipeline even look like? Where are clean tech investors focused in trying to pull forward things from the emerging technology pipeline? The second thing we'll get into is affordability is really top of mind for electricity customers in the US, especially as data center demand is projected to really strain grid capacity here. So where will utilities and the regulators land on capacity expansions, grid improvements and prices? Where are there opportunities there? What are the challenges going to look like? And into that question of cost, we also have to take into consideration how the new US tariff policies are going to be, what implications they're going to have for both cost and access to clean energy technologies. And third, you can't be at a conference that talks about energy and global energy markets and not touch on energy security and geopolitics. So we'll talk a little bit about that and understand how that factors into where the market's headed. We're really lucky to have two industry veterans with us to help us understand all of this. They have seen the industry through many different cycles, bear and bull markets, different hype cycles around different technologies. We have Antoine Wagner-Jones, who's the head of trade and supply chains at Bloomberg NEF, who's previously worked in the renewable energy sector in Japan and on defense policy in France. And then Kate Harden at Deloitte, who leads Deloitte's Research Center for Energy and Industrials and has over 2 decades of experience covering the global energy industry with previous roles also at IHS Markit. So I set some context for us. That was a little bit about where we've been over the past few years, but I want you two to dig in for us where we are now. And let's start maybe with demand and how demand has shifted. Kate, if you could start off, paint your picture of what the current outlook looks like for clean energy demand and deployment, maybe over the next 2 to 5 years, right? What's the data telling us about how demand is shifting? How does that look within overall energy markets? What's your sense?
Thanks for that, and it's great to be here today. And I do like to remind people at the outset that if we look at the capacity additions to the U.S., to the system in 2025, it's 93% renewables. And people will point to the fact that much of that was teed up, under the last administration, et cetera. But I do think that that's certainly a trend that we're watching, right? And I think another trend to watch is, to your point, what's happening with the data center expansion. We know that there are many reasons that power demand is expanding beyond what we've seen in the past. I've had one CEO of a utility say it hasn't grown this fast since the 1950s. This is tremendous what we're seeing. And a lot of that, of course, is data centers. A lot of that is electrification. Some of that's other industrial demand, right? But if we think about data centers and take that as kind of a snapshot, we expect to see a 5 times increase over the next 10 years in data center demand. So just that segment of power demand is going to grow 5-fold. Now, you can talk about these outlooks, and then you have to caveat them with several different aspects, right? Number one, what will the efficiency of chips look like 5 years down the road, even 5 months down the road, right? Second, what about cooling technologies, right? Cooling traditionally is 40% of data center demand for energy. And so as we look at different cooling technologies, we'll see how that shifts, right? So there are a number of kind of risks to that outlook, I would say, but that is, of course, driving a lot of what we're seeing in the power sector right now. And even if we look at that part of the market, it's interesting to note that if, there's been a lot of interest in how having the hyperscalers involved is actually going to forward some of the investments in renewable energy in particular. And in fact, we've seen that 90% of their renewable contracts, actually globally, 90% are sitting in the US. And when you look at what those projects consist of, it is actually quite a bit of solar, quite a bit of wind. And even if you look at the planned, kind of the pipeline for those contracts, then you begin to see geothermal come in and even nuclear. So I do think there are a number of ways in which we're seeing the momentum in the sector right now due to a lot of these different factors. So I would just use that for some context setting.
That's great. Antoine, can I pull you in here to give us a little bit of the global dynamics? How is the U.S. market comparing to other regions of the world regarding clean energy demand and deployment trends?
Yeah, it's good to have perspective, especially when we're sometimes a little bit of a bubble. When you look at U.S. demand as a share of the global total for a lot of this stuff is quite small. So for EVs, the EU demand alone is twice that of the US, which is less than 10% of the global total. For batteries, it's the only really one where it's significant, where it's about 25%. For solar, it's around 10%. For wind, it's something like 4%. And for all of these sectors, China is around 50 to 70% of the global total. And the EU is larger than the US for basically everything. So it's good to sort of look at it from that perspective. There are lots of challenges. There's a lot of discussions around the pace of demand and different dynamics going on in different sectors within the US, but it's not necessarily defining when we're, for example, doing our yearly update of clean energy investment worldwide. And that's because of the weight of the US in the Anglo-Saxon sort of narrative that we have about the energy transition writ large, that can sometimes get subsumed and ignored. But yeah, like it is an incredibly interesting period right now in the US that is being replicated in other places. As Kate mentioned, we are in a really interesting period where we've had 20, 30 years of stagnant load growth. And now the big question is, how do we meet that rising energy demand? And power demand alone, we think it's going to we're on the lower end of the spectrum in terms of data center demand and what we think it's going to be, but we think it's going to sort of raise demand from something like just under 4,000 terawatt hours in the US today to around 5,000 total, with a little bit of that being EVs as well and some other sectors too. But a big chunk of that is data centers. And then what is that met by? That starts to become a really interesting question to answer. And we think a lot of it's going to involve deployment of batteries, which our forecast is sort of remaining robust despite a change of incentives that's happened under OBA, which you mentioned. But there are some big differences for sectors like offshore wind, which has really stalled and which is really being affected by a lot of the investigations that are happening at a permitting level. So we can talk about those different sectors and their dynamics if that's of interest. But globally, I think we can get a bit too focused on what's going on in the US and lose sight of the wider picture.
So your take is, if you're looking at the market and where demand is, it's China and Europe that are the markets people need to be selling into, or where you're seeing a lot of the demand for clean energy technology. That's where the growth is. That's where the demand sits.
That's the case, and there are exceptions to that. And one of the really interesting things that's going on right now is a lot of really interesting dynamics that are happening in the stationary storage market, specifically in the US, and certain technologies like geothermal that are getting a lot more attention here than elsewhere. But generally speaking, that's right.
Well, that's actually a good segue to my next question, which is going to be a little bit more US-centric again, about when we think about the energy transition, there are a lot of different pathways to get to an energy transition. And so how is that shifting? Like, which technologies are kind of like up? Where are you seeing demand shift, and how are investors shifting what technologies they're investing in, and where is the market kind of pulling technologies forward? And Antoine, maybe you start there. You're starting to get into it with batteries and with geothermal. But
yeah, sure. So there's sectors that have been hit quite hard, and EVs is one where we've basically halved our forecast for 2030 because of the fact that fuel standards have been dramatically altered and weakened, fuel performance standards, and the fact that a very important tax credit for purchasing electric vehicles has been removed as of September this year. And that's meant that within the battery space, there's been a bit of a reshuffling, and a lot of manufacturers who are thinking of doing EV batteries are now thinking about the fate of factories that were announced or under construction and are retooling their production lines to maybe focus more on the stationary storage segment, which is not an easy sort of switch of a button type thing, but it's a trend that we're seeing. And again, I've mentioned that the wind sector is really struggling. We cut our forecast for 2035 by about 46%. That's pretty huge in terms of less wind build in the US because of all of these stop work orders, this change towards permitting, and that's a lot harder. But when it comes to technologies where the economics are pretty good, like solar, for example, that is affected by the fact that the investment tax credit the fate of that is a lot more in the air, and it's a lot harder to access. But we do still see robust growth in the solar sector, even though we've tweaked our forecast down a bit. in parallel to this, there's the new administration is talking about nuclear, it's talking about geothermal, it's talking about gas turbines to a much greater extent than was the case in the past. And that's when there are some really interesting questions. There's talk of speed when we talk about data center meeting AI associated power load growth. And that then means that we need to start talking about lead times. And when you're thinking about geothermal, you're looking at 8 years development timelines. So when you're talking about nuclear, it takes well over a decade to build a new plant if it's a greenfield site. And gas turbines right now, we're doing a lot of work on gas turbines because they're very hard to acquire. And there's a lot of detail we can go within that, comparing different types of gas turbines with reciprocating engines, et cetera, et cetera. But generally speaking, there's been a shift of interest towards these sectors, but they might not be the most responsive or the easiest to sort of deploy when it comes to dealing with what we're expecting over the next few years, which is a really rapid growth in total system load.
Yeah. And I would just add to that, if I can jump in, which is we have kind of a framing that we have which shows if you're, from a data center perspective, right, it's going to take you probably 18 to 24 months to get your data center up and running. And if you kind of align the technologies available for producing the power that goes along with that, really solar plus storage, again, there are a lot of ifs. Do you have the space? Can you interconnect? Whatever. But that is like the next best thing almost. And then you've got gas, as long as it's planned, to your point about supply chain. If you haven't already secured your turbine order, that could take you quite a bit longer, right? And then at the bottom of that kind of hierarchy, you have some of the longer term, SMRs, nuclear, et cetera. So there's a number of ways in which we can meet this increasing demand, but it really does depend on what is already in place in terms of siting or interconnections or whatever. And I think this is where we get to that speed to power idea from the data center side and see that in many ways renewables are very much in play.
And the batteries are addressing the reliability concerns of the hyperscalers. Do you think the costs and the technology it can make renewables work for the data centers and their consistency and intermittency concerns?
Well, I think when you think about solar plus storage, you're adding in that reliability factor of it, not just for the data centers, but in general, I would say. I don't know if you want to add on to that.
No, and there's this sort of segues into thinking about costs. And thinking about costs nowadays is really difficult because of tariffs, and there's some sectors where we're pretty much used in the US to paying very high tariffs, like the solar sector. For batteries, that wasn't the case, and that's something that we had, minimal tariffs under the Biden administration, which have been whipsawing up and down with China-specific tariffs, which are of great importance because unlike many other clean tech sectors, the US imports most of its batteries from mainland China directly. So 69% of batteries, lithium-ion batteries last year came from mainland China. And that means that procurement teams are really struggling to plan revenues, financial planning, all of that becomes really tough when you've got huge error bars in terms of what you end up going to have to pay. And that really matters because the economics of stationary storage in the US are good. That's why we've been seeing a doubling of cumulative capacity year on year over the last few years. But they're also on a bit of a knife edge when it comes to competing against gas. So again, all of this is incredibly interesting in terms of trying to do energy system modeling, but incredibly difficult because you end up having to have our energy economics team at Bloomberg NEF is having to sort of make calls about, okay, so we're going to have to find a reasonable tariff that we think might be in place for batteries, and then we have to have assumptions about local manufacturing and what we're buying from Korea instead of Japan, and then we have to look at the gas turbine shortage, and we have to figure out where prices might go and how long the shortage is going to last with the expansion plans that have been announced. There's all of these moving parts, and it becomes really tough.
I mean, what are you hearing from the companies on that side? I used to work at the Fed, and my colleagues there talk about how business executives are driving in fog right now, and it's very, very hard for them to make decisions because of all that tariff uncertainty. But as I hear you talk about it on the stationary storage side, you have a lot of cost questions coming into the supply chain because of the China tariffs and price volatility. And then if you want instead to do the gas turbines, you have a lead time problem. So you have to choose between cost and timing that the executives are facing. Kate, let me bring you back in on this supply chain question. and what insights you can share with us on how supply chains are impacting the companies that you track, both the clean energy companies, the utility and infrastructure companies, and how their strategies around supply chain have had to evolve, not just right now, but maybe over the past few years. How are you seeing these companies address these supply chain questions that Antoine's been talking about?
So I would say I completely agree with your opening comments, Samira, that supply chain now is front and center in a way that maybe we hadn't seen before. But if we reach back a little bit further, there were supply chain questions even before COVID, right? In terms of what's in your supply chain, how, if you think about governance across the supply chain, right? Transportation costs across the supply chain. And then we saw COVID, which I remember being on the phone with manufacturers who were like all hands on deck, just calling up the CEO of their tier 2 supplier and saying, what do you have? How can we get this to work? It really was kind of an unprecedented time, I think, for a lot of the folks that we were talking with then. And then now we have...
I was telling them when we were just meeting just now, that when I was at the White House, like CEOs were literally calling us saying, can you help us get a component? I'm like, it's not my job to help a CEO get a component.
But people were really looking at how can I possibly get this thing to my customer, right? And now we have, I think it's, again, some of that has trained us that we need to focus on supply chain. And as again, going back to some of the CEOs of the public utilities, their point is our company is responsible for reliability, affordability, and safety. Mm-hmm. And now supply chain is integral in all of those aspects, but particularly affordability, like you were saying, Antoine. If it is actually going to take you, 3 times what it used to secure your transformer because of delays, because of potential, import exposure, whatever it is, that's huge from a reliability and safety perspective, right? And also from an affordability perspective. So I think all these things now come together in kind of a unique challenge. I will say, though, that we have seen over the past 3 years, I forget which one of you mentioned it, a real upturn in domestic manufacturing of the particularly clean tech components, right? And whether that's solar panels or various other components, there was always some part of that was going to come from an external supplier, right? We didn't have the whole supply chain 100%, I think, across the board, but we made a lot of progress with that, right? And now I think we're beginning to focus on the same, although maybe in different ways, right? So now we're seeing a lot of companies really focusing on producing gas turbines, right? We're seeing a lot of focus on building transformers. So this idea that we have this rapid growth expected in the power sector is, I think, energizing a lot of focus on supply chain domestically. We've seen tremendous R&D investment, for example, in SMRs. Mm-hmm. And I think we're going to continue to see that because people recognize that supply chain now is affordability, safety, and reliability. So I think those aspects really will keep this front and center for us.
Yeah, and what I will add from my experience thinking about supply chains and supply chain expansions is it takes a long time to build new capacity and to bring it to market. So you really have to have a strong demand signal and a consistent demand signal before companies can make the large-scale capital investments you need to energize the downstream supply chain to start producing the inputs that are needed upstream for the end users. You keep talking, you've mentioned a few times security, so I wondered if you could say a word about supply chain security for the utility companies and how they're thinking about supply chain security and what the relevance is.
Yeah, I would say there are probably 2 main ways in which I would talk about supply chain security. And it's security in the sense that cybersecurity, right? As you expand your supply chain and you have more technology in your supply chain, that of course raises more questions around cyber, right? But I think it's also security in the terms of reliability and resilience. And that, I think, is a question of visibility, and that's the second point I'd bring here. You're obviously in touch with your tier 1 or your tier 2, but do you know who's supplying them? And do you know who it is that's supplying that company that's supplying them? And I think that kind of visibility is becoming so much more important. And we saw, in fact, during COVID, just to reach back a few years again, people actually acquiring their tier 2 or 2-3 supplier just to make sure that they have that visibility across the entire supply chain. So, there were not just advancing digital technologies and acquisitions of suppliers, but a number of different ways in which companies were really trying to make sure they understood where is everything coming from and can I get it on time in terms of my resilience and my delivery to my customer.
Yeah. Antoine, I want to bring you in on this U.S. reshoring, the U.S. manufacturing renaissance or reindustrialization that we're seeing here in the U.S. and anything you're tracking in terms of where is the U.S. weaning itself off of some dependencies, especially with competitors like China, and where are you seeing the U.S. still has some momentum and success on the clean energy technology front, the domestic reshoring and onshoring of components?
Yeah.
Any bright spots you can point us to? But it's okay if it's mainly like low spots, but
No. I mean, we can talk about it objectively. So 2022 Inflation Reduction Act, big deal. Lots of subsidies going into supply chain stuff in general. Huge manufacturing pipeline for, among other things, solar, wind, EVs, batteries, all of this stuff. Factories getting built across the US. A lot of announcements, over 100 billion in total, and that takes a few years to bring to bear and to develop the local supply chains. And what we've seen now is a lot of investment in the downstream side of things. So there is a heck of a lot of investment in downstream batteries. If all of them get built, we're in severe overcapacity in 2030 in the US compared to demand. Well, demand's gone down a bit, which helps. But still.
But stationary storage or EV?
Stationary storage, yeah, you can segment them out, but for EV batteries as well as stationary storage batteries, which is very surprising. There's been a very rapid development of even LFP batteries, the types of batteries that are better suited to stationary storage projects. And for solar, for example, there's been a lot of module manufacturing that's been announced, and even if we de-risk that, inverted commas, basically we don't take every announcement seriously and we have a methodology for working out what we think is likely, then you get around US demand by 2030 as well. So downstream stuff, great, but what that lacks is the development of a supply chain for the midstream inputs, components, so whether that's anodes, cathodes, separators, electrolytes for batteries, whether that's cells, ingots, wafers, all the way to polysilicon for solar. Those are areas where there really hasn't been a lot of serious investment happening. And that's normal. You start with the downstream, you work your way up, but without the continuity in terms of incentives, because we've seen some big revisions in incentives, and whether that's grants or even tax credits or loans or loan guarantees, a lot of that has become either disappeared, even the attributed stuff is now being questioned, or it's going to be a lot harder to access with some pretty dramatic new rules that we're still not sure about, in terms of their final form, what they're going to look like for some of the main tax credits for manufacturing. That then means that stuff starts looking a lot more difficult in terms of building up from those downstream segments.
Can I fill in a little bit there? I think you're alluding to, we still have 45X in place. Yeah. But we now have, which is for manufacturing production of some critical components, but there are new kind of foreign entity of concern. Can you explain the foreign entity of concern kind of constraint that it's still uncertain, still hasn't fully been written?
Yeah, I'm just going to try and not go too in depth on this, but 45X sounds arcane, huge deal. In terms of subsidies for clean tech manufacturing, we've basically counted across G20 countries all of the subsidies that every single national government has made available for clean tech manufacturing. If you sum up what we think is going to be accessed under 45X, or we thought was going to be accessed under 45X through 2032, it's more than every single other country combined. So this is a really important subsidy that gets paid out to manufacturers making lots of different things when what they've produced is sold. So they have to prove that it's been successfully retailed. It's you can call it an incentive that's, it's an OPEX incentive and it's not an upfront grant. But it matters a lot. And that's been salvaged. There was an outside chance that this disappeared in the wake of Ober. That has remained. But what has changed is that so-called foreign entity of concern rules, which you can basically think of as anti-China criteria, are now being affixed to this tax credit. So if you want to access this tax credit, you're now going to have to prove that you have absolutely no Chinese involvement, even in terms of stuff like, not even in terms of ownership of the project, but in terms of debt financing, JVs, components. We're actually not sure because the Treasury still hasn't drawn up the final guidelines for this, which means that we're in this weird limbo phase. Everyone's a bit nervous. No one's really sure what's going on. And that's quite worrying because this incentive matters for the business case for many of these factories.
I may not call it a weird limbo phase. It's just how the American legal system works, that you pass a law, then you have to write the regulation, having been the person to write the guidance for these things. But yes, I agree. The industry is in massive limbo waiting for this, and people can't really design their strategies until Treasury writes the guidance. And there's a lot of opportunity that means for industry to still shape what happens with how Treasury writes the guidance, because there are a lot of levers that can be pulled in how that guidance is written to be more permissive or more restrictive, basically.
So yeah, Treasury guideline takes a while to draw up. We saw that with the hydrogen tax credit under the Biden administration. This stuff takes time. It's hard. But we have seen August the 12th is set as the provisional date for these FEOC rules to be defined. Yeah. And we still have no indication about when they're going to come out. So stuff is difficult when you really have no clarity on incredibly important rules that are going to be linked to incentives that are basically going to define whether or not there is still some degree of success that can be salvaged from the beginnings of this reindustrialization project.
I will add, for those who are tracking this and who are working in the industry, that this is actually a great moment to be engaging with the Treasury Department and with officials in Washington in the agencies with the data, the evidence, the information, because there are a lot of different, there's a lot of bipartisan support for de-risking these clean energy supply chains away from China, and 45X was seen as a really powerful and important tool to incentivize the private sector to start investing in component manufacturing outside of China, even if that was not reshoring everything here in the U.S. too. So it is just, I think, a moment of opportunity for engagement with the data on where the market could head, where it could go, where companies would be investing if they wrote the rules in different ways. And that data that companies like yours supplies is really, really helpful for the regulators who are going to be the wonks writing all of this. It's a very different process than the process of writing legislation.
Yeah, so what we've done, for example, is we've looked globally at manufacturing capacity writ large across many different geographies, and we can say, okay, so this, if we're trying to take Chinese cathodes out of the equation, what does that leave us with? Oh wait, South Korea has 15 times as much cathode manufacturing capacity as it needs for its own demand by 2030. And then you have a jigsaw puzzle that you can start to begin to reassemble. So trying to get this data structured and easily accessible and readable is one of the goals that we're trying to pursue.
Yeah. I know we should move to questions shortly, but I did want to ask one more question. Two more questions, actually. Antoine, first with you, since we're on talking about the geopolitics here. How do you see any movement in China as the choke point in global clean energy supply chains? This is something I worked a lot on, so it's kind of moderator's privilege to ask. Or do you see some positive momentum in terms of de-risking and diversification in the global supply chain?
Yeah, so...
And where? I know it often gets very granular and nuanced and is technology specific.
I'll try and whiz through it. Important caveat one, there's a hierarchy of threats that are being identified in terms of technology and different types of technology and what they could pose from a system perspective that really differs across different categories of products, and that's important work that needs to be done for us to really just begin to talk about the risks involved of depending on a single source for imports. That sounds very abstract, but caveat number two is it's very different to be dependent on a supplier of technology that you install onto your grid and it remains functioning for 20 years versus being dependent on the supplier for fossil fuels. So the share of Chinese exports for solar modules is much greater than Saudi Arabia's share of oil exports ever was, but that's not really comparable as far as I'm concerned, because there's not a continuous supply of the one isn't really needed in the same way as it is for the second.
It's like flow versus stock.
Exactly, great. Then to answer your actual question, there's all this excitement about onshoring and reindustrialization and the IRA and the EU's getting involved, and India's doing stuff, and all these different countries are announcing manufacturing. And actually, when you look at the data, China's share of global manufacturing for basically every single one of these value chains is increasing year on year. We expect that to be the case next year. It was the case last year. It was the case the year before that. And that's
even
sobering.
with transshipment, like they're not, moving stuff into Vietnam and
they're
Malaysia.
doing that. But even then, all these Chinese companies are moving some sort of downstream bits of mostly as parts assembly into places like Southeast Asia, into Central Asia, into Latin America. But even then, the mainland China share is increasing year on year, which is really shocking. But at the same time, I'm going to plug a report we put out in the public domain. Most of the stuff is behind a paywall. This one's not. But we published a report looking at emerging markets and protectionism. And what's really interesting is that Chinese manufacturers right now are desperate to sell their product abroad. The market is saturated. And what you're seeing is these booms in imports happening in Turkey with EVs, for example. In Central Asia, it's the same. Uzbekistan is undergoing a wind renaissance. Pakistan has installed an absolute ton of solar. I was in Mexico and Brazil, and in both of those countries' capital cities, when you order an Uber, like 8 times out of 10, a BYD car rolls up. So that's happening at the same time as we're completely focused about what's going on in the US, and we're completely focused about what's going on in the West, when actually what we're seeing is a huge rise in Chinese exports to emerging economies, which is bringing the energy transition, regardless of what you think about the geopolitics of this, bringing the energy transition within reach for countries where it really wasn't something that was seriously considered. Like Thailand now has a higher share of EVs as a share of passenger vehicle sales than the US does. And Thailand has never had a $7,500 tax credit linked to the sale of passenger electric vehicles. So that is a huge global trend that is accelerating, is generally being pretty much ignored, and seems quite important.
I mean, it is. Can I just say one thing? It is important, and I think it's also important to recognize kind of the historical root of all that, right? Which was China many years ago decided that they were going to try to diversify off of imported oil, particularly coming through the Straits of Malacca, right? So they were, let's have our new energy vehicle policy, let's diversify, let's reduce our dependence on imported energy, and they, for their own national security reasons, began that probably before anyone else really thought seriously about it. So I think they've been at it for longer, is one thing I would say. But I think it's important, and it relates back to your question, which is, are we actually really seeing an energy transition? I would say let's not overly focus on what's happening right here in the U.S. because globally things continue to move, things continue to change, exactly to what you're saying. And I think that all the innovation that we've seen in the U.S., all the new technology that we've seen in the U.S., I would love to see those trends continuing, and keeping tabs on what's happening elsewhere as well.
Yeah. It's interesting on the EV point in particular. The U.S. still remains, the U.S. and China are the top 2 economies in the world. We're still the ones where a lot of market demand is essentially generated. And as you talk about EV and EV penetration around the world, and that being by non-American companies, me as an American economic specialist, I really worry. Like, the U.S. auto industry is 5% of U.S. GDP, anywhere between 3 to 5% of U.S. GDP. It actually is it's a huge source of jobs in a lot of different states in this country. And so the kind of competitiveness implications for the U.S. Of being an energy dinosaur and a technology dinosaur, I think has it could have some real economic competitiveness implications for the U.S. But I'd allow either of you to comment on that if you wanted.
Yeah, I mean, I was in Brussels 2 weeks ago, and the European Commission is completely confused as to what to do because it faces exactly the same issues, and it's not a bloc that can do the same thing as the US, where in the US you've basically got what is basically a ban on Chinese EVs ever hitting American asphalt. It's just not going to happen. Whereas in the EU, that's not the case. You've got some pretty low tariffs that still allow a lot of imports in. And now the EU is trying to figure out what to do and whether or not there's some regulations coming out about forcing Chinese companies into joint ventures with European companies. And there's some tinkering around the edges, but the mood is pretty grim in terms of the automaking sector in the EU. So yeah, there's some really interesting dynamics going on. And we focus a lot on very new technologies and the cutting edge and what's going on in geothermal and SMRs and all of that. The ability of automakers to just provide low-cost EVs is something that is increasingly getting attention, and that's a very good thing because that's what you need if you're going to compete against China.
So my last question before we turn it to audience Q&A is kind of clean tech innovation. What are some trends that you're keeping a close eye on in terms of how technological innovation is hitting energy, utilities, and clean tech? Kate, let me start with you.
Well, I think in terms of scaling a lot of what we're seeing, there are a few things that I would point to. Some of them we've already talked about a little bit, right? One is, kind of business models, right? How do you share the risk, particularly if you're seeing more private capital coming in, a reduction in some of the public capital that was available previously? How do you offset those risks, right? How do you design business models and offtake agreements where, in some cases what we're seeing is that there's a way that you can not only share the risk, but also share the benefit, right? And in Europe, for example, when you put up a data center, you need to account for your waste heat, right? And that can also mean the waste heat becomes an input to someone else's industrial process. It depends on what kind of process heat they need. What are you producing in terms of waste heat, right? But there are ways that you're beginning to see that utilization happening. So some of these new business models and ways to share the risk, but also have my output be your input, or my benefit also be a benefit to you, I think are things that we're seeing more of.
Circular economy type of concept.
Exactly. I think the other, though, is financing. And what we're seeing here in the U.S. is that over the past, I want to say since 9 years, right, since 2016, we've seen the amount of private capital double coming into the U.S. power sector. And it's clear right now a lot of that is actually coming from the tech companies, right? So if we think about the estimates, something like $400 billion in 2025 of CapEx coming in from the tech companies, I think there's a range on that number, but that's roughly what we hear. And you think about what the 47 IOUs are putting in, right? They announced earlier $200 billion of CapEx in 2025. So you can, again, the hyperscalers are paying for chips as well, right? So it's certainly not a perfect comparison. But you begin to understand the amount of new focus, new capital coming in the industry. But part of that's private equity as well coming in. So it's a tremendous time to be leveraging that capital for growth and technology and innovation. So I think that's something to watch. But the other thing I want to come back to, Samira, is workforce. Because we're in a situation in the U.S. where we have seen tremendous infrastructure projects announced. We're trying once again to ramp up manufacturing. And if you think about the $650 billion of infrastructure projects announced just in the past, I think since 2022, that's going to require a tremendous workforce to actually bring that to bear, right? So when you think about expanding the grid, expanding the gas pipeline infrastructure to bring gas to some of the data centers, you think about expanding, renewable energy projects, all of the things that need to go into expanding our capacity in the power sector. Do we have enough people to do that, right? And I'm specifically speaking of some of these jobs like welders, electricians, construction. We're down 500,000 folks in construction right now.
Yeah.
And so, it's not only a component of thinking about the digital skills and the technological skills needed to bring all this technology to scale, but it's also, do we have the folks and the expertise that will build a lot of this as we look at this huge focus on infrastructure right now across many of our different sectors. So I think workforce is a key piece to your point about how do we scale, how do we keep the innovation going?
We think it's like all about physical inputs, but it's about human inputs, and people forget that human capital remains important. The AI robots haven't taken over fully yet.
Absolutely.
But let me actually, since we have not talked about this yet, before we go to Q&A, talk a little bit, because I do a lot on industrial policies, the integration between physical and digital has just kept happening and is accelerating. So what are you seeing on that side in power and utilities in terms of how what are the efficiency technologies? How is the digital integration affecting the power and utility sector too?
Absolutely.
What are investments being made on the digitization trends?
Yeah,
there?
I mean, there are plenty of use cases that I think everybody's familiar with, right? Where you can actually use geospatial technologies for siting, for example. You can begin to use drones to do a lot of the work that line workers might have done in terms of vegetation management, for example. There are a number of ways in which AI is, and even to go into like the oil and gas industry, right, in terms of well logging and reservoir engineering. So there are ways in which we're seeing AI throughout the energy sector increase productivity and free people up for other value-added activities. And even talking about, could you begin to think about applying AI into the siting and permitting process, where you could find a way to prioritize some of the applications and projects that are coming in, for example. So I think there's tremendous interest in how we leverage AI further, whether that's bringing distributed energy resources onto the grid more effectively and allowing for those, not even split second, like even faster, technological advances and criteria that need to be processed faster than a human can actually process them, right? So you would still need the human in the loop, quite frankly, but I think there's a lot of optimism around where the efficiency is increased, smart operations are increased by leveraging AI in the energy sector.
Yeah.
So it's AI for energy, but it's also we got to provide the energy for AI, right? So it's
and it really supports like the distributed energy, the virtual power plants, like some of these like newer models, which are newer methods, which also can help, I think, bring more renewables into the mix.
Exactly.
So let me turn to audience for Q&A. If you just raise your hands.
Sorry, the Q&A for this session is through the event app. So if you can submit in your questions on the event app, we will read them out.
I don't have the event app with me right now.
Sorry?
I don't have the app next to me to be able to field the Q&A.
I can read the questions out.
Thank you.
Okay. So one of the questions coming in is, how are physical climate change risks impacting clean energy supply chains, and what solutions do you see are being implemented?
Yeah.
One of you want to take that?
Well, I think, we look at what happened in the Panama Canal, right? That's an example of where we saw a drought there that basically reduced the voyages quite a bit. I'm sure you probably have followed a lot of that as well, Antoine.
Yeah, I mean, there's shipping lanes being closed. Another example is, which is really interesting, what's been happening in China is that the last couple of years, a lot of manufacturing has shifted towards less coal-heavy and more hydro-heavy regions in southwest China, like Sichuan province, which have been having issues with hydro availability, which led to a lot of polysilicon plants shutting down, which led to a price spike in 2023, I think, and has led to a lot of thinking about how to refigure and rejig where manufacturing is happening in mainland China. So this is relevant in terms of trade, it's also relevant in terms of manufacturing locally, and it's one of the arguments why, there are apolitical reasons why diversification has some benefits.
Do either of you track the insurance side of that question, or no? Not too close. How are insurers trying to manage for that risk?
Yeah, okay. I haven't, but...
Could we go to the next question?
Okay, doesn't seem like a lot of people are submitting. So if you want to raise your hands, I can walk to you. Okay.
All right, I see one over here. You could just stand up. I think we'll be able to hear. Do you want to stand up and ask your question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, as we mentioned about gas turbine shortages, right? And then there's demand for power, firm power. So what do you guys think about existing fossil-based power plants like gas, oil, or coal? Do you think they'll play a key role in fulfilling that demand-supply gap? Because renewables cannot provide firm power, right?
Well, I can say a couple of, okay, so the question, just to repeat, and Antoine, you probably want to take part of this too, but do we have an outlook on the role that fossil fuels may play in terms of filling the gap for the increasing power demand that we're seeing? Is that a fair rendition of your question? Yeah. So just speaking about the US, I think of all those options, coal, gas, oil, obviously gas is in the forefront in terms of what people are thinking about and planning about for the US in terms of meeting that gap to where some of the projections for data center and other demand increases. So just to give you a sense of it, right now we have 37 BCF per day going into the power sector in the US. So gas is about 43% of the total gen mix right now. That was kind of a 2024 number. And we expect to see anywhere from 3 to 12 BCF per day going into of new gas, additional gas going into the power sector over the next 3 to 5 years. So that's a pretty big increase, right? Now, And there are, I want to say, something like 80 or 90 projects already kind of planned and under discussion. Whether they'll come to fruition, yet to be seen, right? But there's a tremendous kind of push for this right now. And it's really about the speed to market idea that we really need to bring that gas online quickly for the data centers who have already purchased their chips and need to be up and running, right? There's a downside risk to that, of course, which is much of what we've just talked about here, which is, have you already ordered your turbines? Is the infrastructure in place? We have so much gas in the US, but getting it out of the Marcellus and the Utica relies on a little bit of additional infrastructure to, kind of that takeaway capacity need to expand out of the plays in order to bring that to where the load centers are. And so there are a number of ways in which there's some caveats on that outlook, I would say. But I think of all the three that you've mentioned, probably among those fossil options, gas is what we're hearing the most about. But what would you say?
Yeah, I would reiterate what Kate did. That was a great summary. There's also some tensions between the current administration's goal of increasing LNG exports and using that gas domestically, which does matter when you look at the balances involved. When it comes to gas turbines and the shortages, that's something that's been getting a lot of airtime. Basically, gas turbines are manufactured by, you could really summarize it to three big players: GE, Vernova, Siemens Energy, and Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. And right now, we're seeing some expansion plans and some announcements that they're going to be up in capacity to be able to sort of work through this backlog. But as it stands at present, you cannot get a new gas turbine for the next 5, 6, 7 years if you're trying to make a new order in the US, which matters a lot. The next question is, that matters for some of the really big data centers. For some of the smaller ones, there are other options in terms of behind-the-meter, smaller gas turbines, lead times for which are shorter, and reciprocating engines. And what we're doing is a bit of a taxonomy in terms of different ways in which we can meet data center demand. It's a note that's going to be coming out in the next couple of months. But that work is important to contextualize this greater debate. But just to reiterate the fact that there are some serious constraints in terms of reconciling increased gas use with infrastructure that exists, with a desire to increase exports, and also with this turbine shortage, which does seem to matter.
But neither of you have spoken about grid-enhancing technologies. Is there anything you're seeing in terms of progress and ability to get more out of the existing wires we have?
Absolutely. And again, it comes back to a lot of AI, I would say, and really thinking about how do you get more through the wires that we have, to your point. How do you think about that from a timing perspective? But there's also a really interesting discussion now that's been in play for the past year or so around thinking of data center load as flexible load. So that because there were a couple of schools of thoughts about this, right? Because all the initial model training was somewhat inflexible and had to be done in an uninterruptible fashion and certain, located in certain ways. Now that we're moving in some cases into inference, for example, so when you type in your ChatGPT query, that actually is interruptible load. The sheer number of those queries means it's still a very big load, but it gives the opportunity to think about, could you envision a data center as participating in a demand response program, right? And it comes a little bit to the upstream planning. When you actually make that connection and you do the load planning, you need to think about it in advance of the data center potentially shifting some of that load. And that can be around time of day, that can be around peak time. But in any event, it requires the software and the AI in order to be able to make that happen with very little latency, basically.
All right, let me go to the next question. I see one here. Go ahead. And then there's one in the back next.
Hi, thank you. You've done a masterful job setting this landscape of opportunities of the clean energy ecosystem in place. I just wanted to try to kind of bring you to a couple of points. If, let's posit, you needed and wanted to invest in manufacturing in the US in the next few years, let's say the course of the current administration, what would you invest in the clean energy component ecosystem, and why?
I'm going to defer that to you, Antoine.
What we've seen is a rejigging of priorities, and this is, you can think about it two ways. Like there's two schools of thoughts when you're building out supply chains. You start from the downstream, you start from the upstream, or you try and work your way up, or you try and work your way down. But you kind of got to commit to one approach or the other, and you have to do it over several years, and that's something that we've seen in East Asia over the last few decades, is a sustained industrial policy that is single-minded, and there is waste, and there are mistakes, and there are cycles, but there is progress. Rather than thinking about what is the exact order of things or which component is needed or what needs to happen, there just needs to be continuity. That's the main thing that matters the most. And what we've seen recently is that we're seeing a lot of funding being removed from clean technology, so from making batteries or solar equipment or wind turbines or EVs, and that's been shifted towards the upstream, so critical materials, so battery metals and rare earths to a much greater extent than was the case before. The issue is that if we start having pendulum swings every 4 years, then that is a real barrier towards doing pretty much anything. And that's where I would say, rather than obsessing over which is the critical node, there just needs to be a selection of, a few sectors and really just making sure that we have that clarity and a bipartisan consensus about what needs to be achieved over the coming years. If there are pinch points that that's the general, I think that's a really important takeaway. And then you can sort of say, okay, so there's a reason why the IRA had very high incentives for wafer manufacturing compared to other segments, and that's because there's really nothing in the US and it's pretty much all in China. So maybe that makes sense in terms of building that out. And then rare earths is something that really does seem incredibly concentrated. So building out refining in the US does seem like it makes sense. You can come up with a hierarchy, but I would say that that's of a second order to just having visibility in the longer term, because achieving anything requires that when it comes to these sectors.
But what I'll add there is, I think when you start to have the more nuanced, granular conversation is where you can identify places where there has been some policy continuity in the US, and rare earths, I think, is one of them. I think minerals, it's kind of a mixed picture because the US is still trying to figure out, do we want to extract here or do we want to process here, or do we want to do a little bit of both? But I think on rare earths, there has been a lot of policy continuity. I think the second thing I think about when you talk about, when you think about where to invest in the US is figuring out what's the size of the market you're trying to serve, because in some instances, it's about, are you the redundancy play for creating, de-risking the US market from China, so when everyone all of a sudden is cut off, you all of a sudden become economic. And I think there are some opportunities there that companies should look at where you're looking, I think like domestic content restrictions are going to keep happening in the US, and there's going to be a price premium on domestically produced goods that can at least serve the defense sector, some critical infrastructure nodes, and people should pay a little bit more attention there. But then it becomes a question of like size of market that you're serving.
If I could add as well, just I think something that's missing from the debate is there really is basically no modeling out there that assumes different levels of onshoring for different technologies and then runs things. You can do a least cost, you can do a least cost modeling exercise where you meet the US's energy needs over the coming few years, and you set the parameters and you let the model run itself, and you come up with a really interesting sort of set of results. What you can then do is run sensitivities about if you're onshoring this or that component. You make some assumptions about the inflationary impact of that on project costs. That changes the relative economics of a battery versus a gas turbine, and then you end up with some radically different results. And that just isn't an exercise that's commonly done by government. It should be done more widely by policy professionals. We've started to do it more, and there's been a lot of interest when we engage, whether it's in DC or Brussels. But that's, as well as discussing, okay, there's this or that node, and we're going to build out this or that thing. I would say, again, taking a step back and talking about continuity, but also talking about things from a system perspective and what's the impact from that angle is something that's completely absent from the discussion, and it's actually quite important.
Well, and just to bring that back to the other conversation around affordability, right? If you think about the fact that already we've seen, and again, this is kind of average retail prices, but a 5% increase in electricity prices at the retail level, and a lot of what we're talking about here would ultimately be, pass through and might show up in that. Now, again, there's a lot of regulatory around that. There's huge concern right now about how do we align the costs of expanding the system with the folks that would be the major users of that new capacity, right? So there are ways to think about it, but I think your point is that this actually does have an impact on affordability in some ways as well.
It's just there are trade-offs and there are value judgments, but you have to have data to be able to sort of come to a conclusion. And a really concrete example is that the cost of a module in the US right now is 25 cents per watt, 25 to 33, I think, is our last estimate. And that's basically 3 times more than the rest of the world. And that's something that, developers, utilities, policymakers, whoever is comfortable with in the US. Solar is still getting built, but we are building, we are deploying modules at 3 times the cost than what is happening in Europe, developing countries, China, whatever. And that's called a trade-off. And that might be okay for solar because the actual equipment cost makes up a relatively small share of the total CapEx stack. But that's a very different picture for batteries, where the actual battery cell makes up about half of upfront CapEx. Yeah. Again, maybe I'm getting too much in the weeds, but just to give some examples about the numbers-based perspective that you need to be able to sort of start talking about this stuff in a concrete way.
Yeah. Anyone else have questions? I saw one in the back there, but I want to see if anyone else should have an eye out for. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for a fabulous discussion, and you have actually teed it perfectly to my question. So we are seeing this conflicting pieces of news. There's so much of rollback of federal policy support for clean tech. At the same time, there's a lot of efforts going into securing the critical minerals required for the transition right now. So there's a momentum going to secure the rare earths, the graphite, and so on. So where does this lead to? Does this actually position for investment into the next step of the value chain after the critical minerals? Is it helping the transition in some way, or it's just you're stockpiling and it goes nowhere?
Well, I would give a quick answer, and then I'm sure you'll want to jump in as well. I think there are a couple of things to consider. First is if you think about, again, supply chain resilience, right? Having all of that is readily available and domestically sourced, I think helps tremendously from that point of view. But it's also about the defense supply chain as well. It's not just about the power sector, right? So many of these critical minerals, and rare earths in particular, are ones that we need for a lot of what goes on in our defense industry as well. And so I think given those two components together, I'm not at all surprised to see that we've had a fairly consistent policy, as you've been saying, and this remains kind of top of mind. But yeah, what would you add to that?
I'd maybe add that there's been a shift of focus in terms of refining metals in the US. The current administration likes the sound of the words critical and strategic and metals, and that's something that is generally seen as a dignified policy objective. But building out that refinery requires local demand if you want to be able to make money in sectors that are very low in terms of margins. And if you're basically halving EV deployment over the next 5 years, then that makes the business case for lithium refineries suddenly a lot more difficult than it otherwise would have been. So there's that. I mean, there's also the discussion around what's critical, what's not, and minerals is really difficult. There was a really bad book that I've started reading and gave up on. It's about rare metals or rare earths. And you got to page 50 in this book, and it didn't name a single one specifically until page 57, I think it was. And that's pretty typical in terms of discussion. We talk about cobalt in the same breath as we talk about yttrium and gallium, and that's not helpful. Cobalt is not going to matter anywhere near as much as we thought it was going to matter in terms of battery chemistries over the next 5 years. And that's very different in terms of a proposition from a defense perspective, from a technology perspective, to certain rare earths that are used in permanent magnets, for example. So again, taxonomies, tables, trying to classify things is really important, and it's something that's just not done as widely as it should have been, or should be, and it means there's lots of confused journalists writing articles that don't really make much sense.
So I have a little bit of a different take as a policymaker and a former policymaker. I think that from the policymaker standpoint, there is a lot of nervousness about making sure we have access to the critical minerals, even though we debate what is on that list of critical minerals. I think then there's also a question of who are the end users those minerals are for. Is it defense supply chains? Is it energy supply chains? Is it just for other goods, whether they're critical or not? And then I'll bring it back to my own experience working with large US corporations who recognize that now that they're starting to pay attention to their supply chain and have visibility, they think that they need their governments to help them secure access to the raw materials because they are competing against a non-market actor like China. And if a country is going around trying to secure access, then companies either in the EU or Korea or the US, like companies in those countries are not going to have access to the raw materials they're going to need to produce any goods. So there's going to continue to be a lot of policy salience to the critical minerals conversation, whether it's going to be about geopolitics and geoeconomics more than like specific macroeconomics. I think I agree with Antoine there that it has much more of a geopolitical and a security flavor to it than like a hard economics flavor to it. But there, I think, still will be a lot of efforts out there. And I think what I'm looking for is also, I think some of this stuff doesn't really reach the headlines, and it's not stuff that people read about as readily, but where is this administration going to go in terms of its diplomatic partnerships there? We don't have every mineral that we need here in the US. We're a very mineral-rich country, but we don't have everything, and it's not accessible, and it's not ready. And I think some of the places policymakers are debating is also like, where do they play a role in creating price stability and policy certainty in certain mineral markets, with like debates around, can there be like new insurance mechanisms, new stockpiling mechanisms? Do we have to think about that in a world that needs to de-risk supply chains and in which you may have like a new set of technologies that are trying to rapidly expand where these are going to be important. So any final question? Okay.
Hi, so I've really enjoyed your discussion and presentation, but my question is related to, of course, evolving battery technology. So now, of course, there's development of sodium-ion batteries and also LFPs, and these types of batteries can have more of an impact on storage because it has less energy density. How do technologies like this change the security implications of mineral extraction for supply chains, and would it also like reduce environmental impacts from mining and other factors, or are these technologies not fully able to catch scale yet?
So LFP batteries, so lithium, iron, ferrous batteries are a specific type of battery that is less energy dense than what was the mainstream, which were nickel-based chemistries. The expectation was that they really weren't going to take off because the energy density wasn't there, it wasn't going to be worth building them out. That's changed because their density has increased over time, and they're actually a lot cheaper. And actually, this is what's really huge, is that we talk about batteries and everyone thinks DRC, human rights issues. Everyone thinks Indonesia, high-pressure acid leaching, and nickel, when actually LFP batteries have neither any nickel, nor do they have any cobalt. So the fact that we have, over the last 4 years, dramatically, along with basically the industry, revised our forecast, and we think that these LFP batteries are going to play a much, much, much bigger role in the future chemistry mix, not just for stationary storage, where they can compensate more easily for their lower energy density, but also for the EV market, where they're increasingly mainstream, has dramatic implications, and basically means that, all of this talk about the role of the DRC suddenly becomes a lot less important than it once was. And might sound like good news. It's also bad news for a lot of these emerging economies who are promised a lot of support for building out refineries, or moving downstream. In Indonesia, there's a ministry that has the word downstreaming in its name. Like, this is really important for a lot of these countries and how they see sort of building a niche for themselves in the future of an energy system that looks very different to that we have today. And in a world where our expectations about which minerals are going to be used are whipsawing left to right from one year to the next, that then means that there's some pretty serious discussions that need to be had in terms of how we start engaging again with these emerging economies and not just leading to disillusionment. And then sodium-ion batteries, we've just updated our forecast. We think they're not going to take off dramatically in a big way. We think sort of over the next 5-10 years, they might have a bit of a niche where they suddenly get towards sort of 5-10% of total battery demand. They do have some advantages, but they are just going to be too costly to really compete with the mainstream lithium-ion-based battery chemistries, to give the high-level overview.
And LFP is, I mean, there are countries using that in their bus fleets for many years already. I mean, this is not necessarily a new technology. I think it's just kind of a relook, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's really interesting. Like a lot of LFP manufacturing, even more concentrated in terms of the know-how in China. Now South Korean companies are desperately trying to catch up. And also a lot of the factories that were set up in the US for battery manufacturing are starting to try. There's been a few attempts at retooling the production lines that are getting set up to produce LFP batteries. So there's some interesting developments there as well.
All right. Well, I see that we're at time. I wanted to see, is there anything you guys wanted to offer in terms of any closing thoughts for the group and for the folks as they go and enjoy the rest of the conference?
This is a space where there's a lot of politicized debate, and things are often talked about in very vague terms. Trade and supply chains don't really lead to objective discussions most of the time, and numbers are good. That is my conclusion.
And I think my conclusion is that innovation is good, and I know this group and the wider group of folks that are in energy right now have already accomplished so much innovation, and there's so much more to do. And so that's where I think I would weigh in at the end of the conversation. And thank you for being our moderator.
Yeah, numbers, nuance, and innovation, I think, is a good way to leave it. Thank you all for joining, and thank you to Kate and to Antoine.